All right, so we're going to talk about the Civil War today. So we'll start with our starting date here, which is April 12th, 1861. This is when the Civil War began. So you had the first shots fired at a place called Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And this occurred when a northern fort in South Carolina, which is in the South, needed to be resupplied. And so Lincoln sent supplies to the fort, and the Southern Army, in an effort to kind of prevent that from happening, you had the first shots being fired. So the war begins April of 1861. This is after South Carolina seceded in December, followed by a number of other southern states in January. So it was 3 months after the southern states had seceded and the first shots were fired. The war ends 4 years later, almost exactly, April 9th, when the Southern General, Robert E. Lee, he surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant, the main Union general, in April of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So this is a 4-year-long war. It was extremely bloody because on both sides you had Americans getting killed, both on the North and the South. And it was it's a new battlefield technology that raised the body count plus strategy, which we'll talk about a bit later. All right, going into the war, there are some things that we should know. First of all, the border states. These are really important states. These are 5 states that were kind of in the middle between the North and the South. So there are states like Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, later West Virginia. Right? These are slave states, states where slavery was legal, that did not secede from the Union under pressure from Lincoln, and sometimes military pressure from Lincoln. And they resulted in Lincoln kind of emphasizing the idea of preserving the Union, of bringing the South back into the Union, and de-emphasizing the issue of slavery, at least at the beginning. So these border states were deemed crucial because if they went to the South, then that would give the South some advantages. So Lincoln really wanted to make sure he kept the border states in the Union, and he was ultimately successful in doing that. Overall, the Union had some strengths and weaknesses. The Union had mostly all their strengths were in material supplies, people, money, industry, railroads, all that kind of thing. All the physical stuff you need to fight a war, the Union had all the advantages. However, they had some disadvantages too. Not everybody supported the war. Not everybody wanted to end slavery, and so they were nervous about the war becoming that. They also opposed the war because they felt like if the South wants to secede, let them go. So public opinion was divided, which meant that if the war wasn't going well, it would become increasingly unpopular and make it harder for Lincoln and the Republicans to continue waging the Civil War. Also, in terms of military disadvantages, it's always harder to go in and conquer land rather than defend land. So the Union, in order to win the war, they had to go and recapture the South, which is much harder to do. The Confederacy had strengths and weaknesses too. The Confederacy was led by a guy named Jefferson Davis, so that's a name you should know. And in terms of their advantages, they were pretty united, at least the white Southerners were. I mean, obviously African Americans were not. But for the white Southerners, they had united opinions. They all agreed that this was the right move to make. And they only had to defend their land, right? So they had to just keep the North out. The longer the war stretched, the more of a chance the Confederacy had of winning because the North would get tired of fighting. Also in the South, they had better trained military. They had better leaders, generally speaking, and also their kind of lifestyle of the South of hunting and using weapons and riding horses. This was something ingrained in their culture, so everybody grew up in the South doing those things, whereas that wasn't necessarily true in the North. Disadvantages, though, the Confederacy lacked the infrastructure. They didn't have railroads, right? They didn't have a manufacturing base. Okay. They also had very little international support, which they were hoping to get from places like Britain because they felt like Britain needed Southern cotton. However, Britain was just colonizing India and was getting its cotton from India, so Britain did not come in on the side of the South. Also, Britain opposed slavery generally. Also, their government was a disadvantage because they were a confederacy, kind of like the Articles of Confederation. They lacked centralized authority, right? So there was not a lot of consistency at the leadership level in the South in terms of getting all the states working together. Also, because they lacked this manufacturing base and industrial support, they actually printed a lot of money because they had to buy stuff. So they printed their own money, which results in high inflation. Also, during the before going into the war, Congress did some actions too to kind of strengthen the Union. They created the National Bank Acts. This created kind of the first national banking system, and they issued a greenback currency. This is kind of like the dollars that we have today, but not exactly, right? This is the first kind of national currency that we had had. Also, they instituted a military draft in 1863 because there was a lack of volunteers, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So this military draft was a way to kind of get more Union soldiers into the army because of the divided public opinion. Not a lot of people were volunteering, at least after the initial enthusiasm kind of wore off, in part because the war wasn't going well for the North. Which brings us to our first contradictory characteristic here, the New York City draft riots. These were Irish workers that kind of led these draft riots. They opposed the war and the draft. They opposed the war because they feared that if slavery ended, then African Americans would be competition for their jobs. So they kind of blamed African Americans for the war. In addition, they opposed the draft too because the Irish were generally poor, and the draft was set up so that people could buy their way out of the draft. So you could pay a fine and not serve. Well, of course, if you don't have money, you can't pay that fine. So the Irish felt the draft was both unfair to them economically because of potential job competition for African Americans, and also unfair because the draft itself was set up in a way that was kind of rigged against them. So also in our contradictory characteristics, Lincoln is kind of bending the rules of the Constitution, in some cases breaking them, right? He had disloyal Northerners arrested, particularly in the border states, and he kind of suspended parts of the Constitution, some of the rights that people had, in part because he wanted to make sure the border states stayed in the Union. So anybody who criticized Lincoln was at risk for being arrested and put in jail, and they didn't have to be charged for a crime. It was just a way for Lincoln to kind of take them off the table so they couldn't speak out against the war. Okay, so during the war, there are two groups of people I want to talk about in particular. One is women. So in the South, women managed the farms as men were fighting off the war, kind of similar to the Revolutionary War. They also worked as nurses, and one result of the war is because there was a high number of widows, women whose husbands had been killed in the war. After the war, more of these women had to work outside the home because they had to support themselves because they didn't have a husband to support the family. On the other hand, women in the North, they also worked as on the battlefield as nurses, so that was something that they did. Even though at first there was a lot of resistance by doctors that women shouldn't be allowed to do that. So you had the U.S. Sanitary Commission kind of promoting women as nurses, and what they used is kind of the stereotypical gender roles that women were more caring and nurturing and that sort of thing, and that they could take care of the soldiers as a way to kind of persuade people that women as nurses would be okay. All right, the other group is African Americans. So African Americans in the South, they were slaves, right? And so during the Civil War, the slave owners were afraid that slaves would run away. And so they had more severe restrictions. They were kind of tougher on the slaves during this whole time. Slaves also had more resistance because the normal slave masters were off fighting the war. So you had the women running the farms, plus maybe some younger sons who weren't quite old enough to fight in the war. So slaves saw an opportunity for resistance. Plus, word travels fast, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And slaves were escaping more too. That also has to do with the Emancipation Proclamation. So there were slaves that were looking for escapes and taking advantage of the opportunities given to them to escape at a higher rate than even before this. African Americans in the North played an important role too. At first, they were not allowed to fight in the war because, again, remember, Lincoln is making the war in the beginning about preserving the Union. So African Americans were kind of not allowed to fight. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, they were allowed to fight now, and many volunteered, but they were given mostly jobs as laborers. So think about the irony here, right? You have slaves in the South that are actually doing work to help the South win the war. I mean, not because they wanted to, because they were forced to. But in the North, you have African Americans that volunteered to fight, but they're not being allowed to fight. They're being forced to do labor, just like almost as if they were slaves, and they're paid very, very little. You had the 54th Massachusetts Infantry that also was commanded by white officers. And then we have kind of like the battles and strategies down here. So the Union, they had a naval blockade to try and stop the South from selling cotton. Okay, Lincoln had some trouble finding good military leaders, and you have Gettysburg and Antietam as kind of the two main battles. A failed Southern attempted invasion in Gettysburg, and the bloodiest battle at Antietam. Okay, all right.